There are corridors that do not appear on maps, tunnels that breathe as if they were ancient organisms, keeping memories that no book could preserve. And at some times, when walking along a quiet, silent, and seemingly ordinary European street, you feel, without knowing how to explain it, that something pulses beneath your feet, as if the earth had stories that he preferred to whisper, not shout, stories that survived because they chose the underground as their shelter. What if these hidden corridors weren't just human constructions, but entire chapters of our own soul waiting to be remembered? If you feel that certain things are not coincidence, maybe this video is what you needed to hear, because before cathedrals, before kingdoms, before borders, there were passages underground crisscrossing Europe like veins of an ancient memory. Some served as a refuge, others like temples, still others, such as paths of spiritual initiation, where the human being descended not only through the earth but inside himself. Prehistoric people walked through these galleries with torches shaking like little suns. Medieval monks prayed hidden in rooms carved into the rock. Soldiers, centuries later, they used these same tunnels to survive wars that tried to erase the past. But what about before that? What was there before history began to record its own existence? Many of these corridors emerge from times so distant that they seem to defy our understanding. You look at a worn stone, at a tool mark, and you realize that it was made by human hands. But by which hands? Who carved tunnels perfect when the surface was still wild? Who aligned entire passages with mathematical precision? Who decided that certain doors should remain closed to always? Underground Europe is not just geology. It is emotional archaeology, one spiritual topography, a buried memory waiting for someone who dares to ask, what that we are stepping on without realizing it. And there is another mystery, perhaps the quieter one. In all cultures, in all continents, human beings have always returned underground when they needed to be reborn, when the surface became hostile, or when the spirit needed silence to awaken something bigger. Coming down was a ritual, a return to the womb of the earth, a crossing of portals that they had no doors, but they had meanings. Maybe that's why these corridors they fascinate so much, because they talk about us, of what we hide, of what we protect, of what we still don't have the courage to reveal. And then the inevitable question arises, what is still down there intact, waiting for the right time to return to the light? If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here. What if Europe's underground corridors are not just ancient structures, but maps left by civilizations we don't yet recognize? When we look at a map of Europe, we see borders, rivers, mountains, cities. But what we never see is its other side, the underground Europe, one that has never been seen before. He accepted light as the only possible language. There are archaeologists who say that these corridors are just human works, fruits of wars, escape routes, systems of mining. But when you enter some of them, you immediately feel that there is something more deep there, a feeling that walls listen, that silence has memory, that each step awakens something that has remained dormant for centuries. It's as if the earth kept secrets that could not be told on the surface because many did not were ready to listen to them. The first revelation of this journey is simple, and at the same time disconcerting. Europe. It's much hollower than we imagine, not empty, but full of tunnels, rooms, chambers, labyrinths that cross kilometers of stone. Some are so old that its origin became a tongueless whisper. Others were created in more recent, but with purposes that escape modern logic. The truth is that these corridors form a second, invisible continent, an underground mirror that runs parallel to the surface world, as if there were two Europes coexisting and rarely touching each other. What few know is that ancient Neolithic people already excavated passages under lands which today belong to Germany, Austria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Narrow tunnels, long, carved with impressive precision, connecting entire regions. The doctrine traditionalist insists they were just symbolic shelters or storage routes. But when you look at the alignment of these corridors, you notice something intriguing. Many follow specific, almost ritual directions, as if obeying maps that do not correspond to no current geography. It's as if they point to knowledge that has been lost, or to a spiritual intention that we have not yet been able to decipher. From an emotional point of view, These tunnels evoke sensations that are not we experienced in surface. The darkness there is not just the absence of light. She looks like a dense hug, ancient, touching something primal within us. Maybe it's because the underground represents symbolically what we prefer to hide: fear, instinct, deep memory. But it also represents the return, the womb, the reconfiguration of being. That's why monks, initiates, and men seeking answers always came down. They knew that certain knowledge does not flourish in the sun. They grow in mineral silence, in space narrow where there is no distraction. Science tries to interpret these corridors as purely functional works, but many sometimes stumbles upon paradoxes. There are underground structures whose engineering surpasses the technology of the time. There are tunnels that connect to significant points in the sky, as if marked not only territories, but the cosmos itself. And there are cameras that produce specific resonances, sound frequencies that alter the perception of whoever enters. All of this suggests that these environments were created for more than survival. They were made for transformation, psychological, spiritual, or both. And at that point, the mystery touches science. Why were so many of these spaces deliberately sealed? The reflection that arises is inevitable. Europe's underground is perhaps the largest collection of untold stories of humanity. Stories that did not fit into official narratives, that required shade to stay alive, that were protected by the soil itself until someone finally decided to look for them. When you walk down a narrow corridor, carved millennia before its existence, it realizes the fragility of time, humanity. It changes, rearranges itself, reinvents itself, but the earth holds everything. She doesn't forget. She files. It preserves it for when we are ready. And it is precisely at this point that the turning point occurs. Many of these tunnels appear to have been made to convey something, not just to hide, as if they were letters written in stone, waiting for the right reader. Symbolisms appear repeatedly: paths in spiral, circular chambers, false doors, corridors that end in smooth walls, no by mistake, but by intention. All of this suggests rituals, initiatory passages, moments of symbolic death and spiritual rebirth. Maybe these places were built to teach, to test, to awaken. And if so, the question remains: who were they? The teachers? In the end, what these tunnels do is invite us to listen to the underground, as if listening to the own unconscious. They speak to the side of us that still remembers what we once were of being modern, before being urban, before being just surface. And when we pay attention, we begin to notice that something within us responds, as if he recognized these corridors, as if I had already walked through them before. But what happens when these tunnels are not just vestiges of the past, but doors that lead to something that Europe never had the courage to admit? When we talk about ancient tunnels in Europe, we imagine rudimentary corridors excavated with simple tools. But the truth is that some of these passages defy historical logic. In the heart of the continent, there is a mysterious network known like Erdstelle, small medieval tunnels, or pre-medieval as some dare suggest, spread across Germany, Austria, and the Alpine region. They are too narrow to be escape routes, too small to store food, too quiet to have been places of coexistence. And yet, they were made with great effort, as if every curve of the stone had been shaped with sacred purpose. There, the underground appears not as a shelter but as a portal. A portal to where? The most accepted interpretation states that these tunnels were symbolic, used in rituals of spiritual rebirth. Many have narrow entrances called screw holes. Passage, so small that they force the human body to crawl, compress, shrink. This physical gesture evokes the crossing of the womb, a symbolic return to the womb of the land. Movement is not comfortable. It is transformative. And whoever went through this, kind of the hallway didn't come out the same. It is as if the ancient Europeans already understood that the subsoil did not. It's just geography, but psychology. A topography of the invisible. A space where the soul is forced to confront her own vulnerability. But there are even older tunnels, so old that they lose their name and become just hypothesis. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, archaeologists have found passages underground structures linked to Neolithic dwellings, built thousands of years before the first cities emerge. Some say they were deposits, others which were shelters. But again, something doesn't fit. Many of these spaces were carefully sealed by their own creators. as if they had completed a cycle that should not be repeated. When you look at the stones, you realize that the closure was not a collapse natural. It was human intention. Why would someone eternally lock a space that didn't require so much effort to build? The answer may not just lie in functionality, but in mystery. This is the emotional part of the journey. As you walk through these places, you feel like you are playing an echo, as if he were repeating the steps of people who followed those same routes in search of healing, protection, or contact with something they were unable to explain in words. And archaeology, despite its precise tools and methods, there finds a frontier. What was constructed for the spirit cannot be explained only with dates and measurements. The underground holds stories that refuse to fit into equations. It demands listening, not just analysis. And then comes the turning point. Europe has tunnels so vast, so old, and so perfectly aligned that many experts admit, in hushed tones, that the exact origin remains uncertain. There is talk of underground paths that would connect distant regions, of passages that ran beneath ritual hills, from chambers designed to amplify sounds specific. There are places where a whisper turns into a song, others where a step echoes like a deep drum beat. Could this be chance or intention? Many of these tunnels look like conversations between stone and human consciousness, as if ancient civilizations had discovered that sound, underground, is capable of altering mental states and opening interior doors. And maybe that's why these places are still alive, not because of form, but by spiritual function. The contrast becomes even clearer when we understand that people separated by thousands of kilometers who never met built such similar structures. Tunnels narrow, circular chambers, low entries, hidden exits. Science may suggest coincidence or cultural convergence. The symbolism, however, suggests common memory. One deep memory, perhaps ancestral, perhaps prehistoric, perhaps even prior to that we call civilization. It is possible that these corridors are remnants of an ancient knowledge that crossed eons, disappeared from the surface, but remained kept beneath our feet as silent testimony. But the most fascinating thing is to see how these tunnels transform those who visit them. Descend changes breathing, reduce the light. It forces the body to bend over. The mind, in turn, stops operate at the accelerated rhythm of the surface and begins to operate at another frequency. Slow, meditative, almost ancestral. Perhaps the ancients sought exactly this, a state where the spirit could hear what everyday life silenced, a state where being human being encountered what he did not dare face in daylight. And so each corridor becomes a mirror, not the mirror that reflects the face, but the one that reveals the interior. In the end, understanding these tunnels is also understanding ourselves, because when the story disappears and the scientific explanation is limited, what remains is to ask, why has a human being always descended? Why did you seek the underground before seeking the sky? Maybe because, before ascending, we need to dive. Before evolving, we need to remember. Before finding answers, we need to go through the darkness that preserves what we forget. And when we look at these European tunnels, we realize that they are just old structures. They are invitations to return to the point where the soul and the land still spoke the same language. But what happens when these passages stop being just human works and begin to point to presences that do not appear in any official record of history European? As we advance through the European underground, we begin to notice something that goes beyond of archaeology, a kind of invisible coherence between different peoples, eras, and beliefs. Underground cities emerge as reflections of the same human restlessness, the desire to disappear from the surface to find something deeper, quieter, more true. There are entire cities like those in Malta, where narrow corridors lead to circular chambers that echo specific frequencies, designed to alter the state of consciousness. There are caves carved beneath British hills, used by druids in rituals nocturnal. There are secret tunnels beneath European castles and monasteries, many of which remain closed to the public to this day. When we observe this multiplicity, we realize that the underground was never just about escape. It was always a passage to another type of perception. From a historical point of view, these places served as shelters during invasions and wars. But when you walk through them, it's impossible to ignore that their proportions, their alignments, and symbols suggest much older functions. In many cases, the oldest tunnel is also the most mysterious. Its features are more primitive and, paradoxically, more perfect, as if they had been made with spiritual intuition, not with sophisticated tools. It is there that sensation changes. You stop feeling that you are entering a shelter and starts to feel like you are entering a portal. The people of ancient times believed that the earth had crossing points, places where the world visible and invisible touched each other. Perhaps these tunnels are traces of this ancient cosmology. In emotional terms, the impact is unavoidable. As you descend, you notice that the silence changes texture. It is a dense, charged silence, a silence that not only envelops but seems to observe. And light, when there is light, takes on a different vibration, as if was being filtered through centuries of mineral memory. This environment affects the body and mind. Breathing slows down. Time expands. The perception intensifies. Many describe feelings of déjà vu, as if they were returning to a place they had never been before, visited, but that, in some way, they knew before. It's this mysterious familiarity that led so many mystics to interpret the underground as a spiritual mirror. Upon entering these corridors, you don't just observe history, you find parts of yourself again. But then comes the twist. These tunnels weren't just used for spiritual rituals. In many times, they were scenes of secret meetings, political negotiations, disputes religious. Medieval cathedrals hid passages that led to crypts where prohibited documents were kept. Monastic orders used corridors underground to transmit messages away from the eyes of the court. Some cities have created entire networks of tunnels to protect archives, relics, and important people. And throughout over the centuries, many of these spaces have been sealed off, not by physical necessity, but by deliberate decision to hide. The underground then becomes a guardian of silences. Silences historical, spiritual, and even diplomatic. The reflection that arises is profound. Why have human beings always returned underground when I needed to preserve something sacred? Maybe because the surface changes quickly too much, because the wind takes memories, because fire destroys records. But the earth, the land guard. The earth protects that which cannot yet be understood, and the hallways underground areas of Europe become witnesses of this ancestral trust. The trust of that certain truths only survive in the shadows. Like seeds that need the darkness to germinate, these tunnels preserve ideas that might have been too bold for their epochs, too dangerous for the powers that be, or too profound to be shared with everyone. The contrast is accentuated when we realize that many of these underground cities are not. They were improvised. They were planned. Some had ventilation systems capable of to feed hundreds of people. Others had private water wells, communal rooms, acoustic systems that amplified the voice of those conducting ceremonies. All this indicates advanced knowledge, but also clear intention, to create spaces where the community could exist temporarily between worlds. Among the surface world, noisy, political, changeable, and the underground world, silent, ritualistic, eternal. These cities, they were more than shelters. They were bridges. Bridges between human needs and mysteries divine. When contemplating all this, we understand that the underground has always represented what is beyond human control. It is the space of the invisible, the buried, the not yet revealed. And this is perhaps the biggest revelation. Europe's tunnels were not created only to protect people, but to protect meanings. Because there is knowledge that can only be transmitted in the silence of the earth. There are encounters that only can happen away from light. There are transformations that require the weight of the world above the head, as if the planet itself were present, witnessing the change. Ultimately, what these runners do is remind us that the human journey has never been only upward, towards the sky, but also downward towards the depth. The search spiritual movement is not unidirectional. It's curved, it's spiral, it's descent and ascension. The ancient Europeans understood that, to reach the top, one had to first cross the silence that lives below. And this understanding still echoes today when explorers, scientists, and seekers descend underground not only to study history, but to understand themselves. But what about when these underground spaces stop being just spiritual refuges and become repositories of secrets that entire institutions fought to keep? And when we descend further into the European subsoil, We enter a zone where science and mystery begin to touch. Geology offers rational explanations. Caves, formed by water erosion, tunnels dug by human hands, galleries shaped by time. But there are places where science falters, where the data doesn't fit, where silence weighs more than the evidence. It is in these spaces that the feeling of being in front of something much older than the civilizations we know, something that witnessed entire eras of humanity, and yet remained buried, keeping secrets that perhaps we are only now prepared to hear. Archaeology tries to reconstruct the origins of these corridors, but often finds interruptions in the narrative. There are tunnels whose estimated age predates the first cities Europeans. There are marks that do not resemble known tool patterns, prehistoric. There are chambers that seem to have been designed with techniques that would only appear millennia later. What if, instead of thinking about linear evolution, we consider the possibility of cycles? Civilizations that rose, disappeared, and left only traces dark as fragmented memories. Perhaps, the underground is the only place where these memories have not been erased. On an emotional level, these spaces provoke something difficult to translate, a kind of ancestral recognition, as if there was a point inside us that responds when we enter very old caves, very deep tunnels, rooms whose purpose was lost. It is as if the soul realizes that human history did not begin where we imagine, as if these corridors were clues left not to impress, but to remember, remembering a time when human beings walked the earth more than the surface, more by intuition than by reasoning. Remember wisdom forgotten that sleeps under layers of stone. From an interpretative point of view, there is something fascinating. Many of these tunnels seem built not just to house bodies but to alter consciousness. Acoustics resonant, circular chambers with unusual geological patterns, walls capable of conduct sound vibrations like giant instruments. Science can explain part of these phenomena, but does not explain the intention. Why build a space where sound turns into experience? Why create environments that modulate perception, such as if they were natural temples designed to expand the human mind? Maybe these places were schools. Not conventional schools, but schools of the spirit where learning happened at deeper levels. The reflection that arises is inevitable. What if the European subsoil records not only the history of civilizations, but the history of their perceptions? And if these tunnels are testimonies of how human beings sought to understand the universe not only from external observation, but from internal transformation? It's a thought that connects science and spirituality at a sensitive point. The idea that evolution is not just advancement technological, but expansion of consciousness. Maybe ancient people weren't primitive. They just had different priorities. Their technologies were perhaps more subtle, more emotional, more sensorial. Perhaps they knew that certain structures were not intended lasting on the outside, but on the inside. And then we come to the point of contrast. There are tunnels in Europe that do not correspond to no known construction style. Tunnels whose engineering defies the period in which should have been built. Tunnels that appear to have been precisely planned mathematics, as if they aligned not only physical spaces, but energies. Science prevents this type of reading, and rightly so. There is a lack of concrete data, but the mystery remains insistent. What would lead an ancient civilization to create hidden corridors that never? Did they serve obvious practical purposes? Rituals? Protection? Communication with something bigger? The answer may lie in the way these passages were hidden, sealed, preserved away from the eyes of the world. It is at this point that emotional development intensifies. We realize that we seek only ruins. We look for questions, and when we look for them, we discover that the European underground is like a library without books, where walls replace pages and silence replaces text. A library created by humanity itself to store fragments of its beginning, its middle, and its forgetfulness. And this library seems to us watch as we try to figure it out, as if we know we're about to understand something that has been dormant for millennia, and the synthesis emerges like light amidst the gloom. Perhaps these corridors are more than older structures. Maybe they are invitations. Invitations to remember that the human history has not only been about rising, but also diving. That before we raise temples to heaven, we raise temples in darkness. That before searching answers outside, we try to find them inside. And In this sense, the underground tunnels European are not just objects of study, they are mirrors, mirrors that force us to confront the depth we carry and fear accessing. If you feel something inside you awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here. But what happens when these runners start connecting to documents, hidden secrets, secret orders and files that entire governments tried to hide from memory collective? As we progress through the underground labyrinth of Europe, we realize that we cannot only ancient civilizations left marks there. Much more recent institutions, orders, religions, discrete societies, governments, and military forces also discovered in these tunnels something that the surface could not offer: control, silence, and invisibility. From the Middle Ages, corridors that had been ritual became strategic. Crypts turned into archives. Secret passages connected sacristies, chambers, council, and rooms where delicate decisions were made away from the eyes of the people. The land offered what the outside world did not allow: the possibility of keeping truths uncomfortable without letting them disappear completely. The first major revelation of this layer is that many European institutions knew exactly where certain ancient tunnels were located, and they chose to use them. Monasteries built on prehistoric caves, underground libraries that preserved texts considered threatening, Templar orders that built their fortresses aligned with old corridors. None of this is accidental. The combination of spirituality, politics, and secrecy produced spaces where information was kept not out of fear, but out of reverence, where documents were hidden not to disappear, but to survive the storms of the time. The underground became the guardian of the truths that surface could not support. And emotionally, this realization changes everything, because these tunnels are no longer just works of distant peoples and become witnesses of centuries of imposed silence. Imagine manuscripts hidden under the floor of a cathedral, protected by generations that never revealed their existence. Imagine underground rooms where alliances and ruptures were discussed and heresies. Imagine corridors where figures walked, that were never mentioned in the books but whose decisions echoed throughout Europe. The earth once again does not judge, just keep it. And you keep it, because you know that some truths can only be understood after a long time. But then comes the turning point. There are tunnels that are not included in official records, that do not appear on no known maps, but have been reinforced, enlarged, and sealed by institutions whose archives remain inaccessible. Some were covered after religious wars, others during political conflicts, still others during the Second World War worldwide, when military forces appropriated ancient caves to protect codes, relics, and strategic information. This reveals a pattern. Whenever the world goes into crisis, the underground once again becomes a storehouse for everything that needs to survive. The surface destroys, a depth preserves. Psychological reflection is inevitable. What we don't want to show, we hide. What we can't destroy it, we bury it. What we fear to understand, we silently archive. The underground is the materialized unconscious, the physical proof of that entire societies behave like individuals, guarding their shadows, postponing confrontations, hiding fragments of themselves for a future moment. It is as if all these institutions had intuitively understood what Jung described centuries later, that the shadow does not disappear, she just changes places. The contrast of this perception emerges when we think about the military. Use of tunnels. For many are just bunkers and shelters, but there are chambers that were built with acoustic precision, as if they were designed for sensitive meetings and not just for physical protection. There are corridors that connect to much older networks, as if were continuations of prehistoric paths. There are structures that seem designed to preserve something more valuable than lives: ideas. Ideas that were too dangerous to circular, but too important to be deleted. And then the emotional synthesis emerges. The European underground has become an archive of everything that humanity was not ready to face. Spiritually, politically, historically, these are tunnels that hold forbidden beliefs, documents that could rewrite entire chapters of history, reliquaries that contain memories that do not fit into official narratives. And upon realizing this, we feel a mixture of fascination and uneasiness, because we understand that these runners don't provide easy answers. They offer deep questions, questions that cross centuries, questions that still echo today in the mineral silence of the walls that witnessed so much. Finally, we realize that these tunnels are not just physical structures. They are symbols. Symbols of a continent that hid more than it revealed. Symbols of a past that didn't disappear. It just went quiet. Symbols of a humanity that always knew that some truths required darkness to survive. And maybe that's why that by exploring them, we feel like we're not just walking through stone. We are walking through the very memory of the world. But what happens when we realize that these tunnels don't just reflect the story of institutions and civilizations, but they also reflect what we hide inside us? Want to go down one more level? When we reach the deepest level of this journey, we realize that the tunnels of Europe stops being external structures and becomes living metaphors. Because deep down, each underground corridor reflects something within us. Unfaced fears, memories hidden, truths that we avoid illuminating. Europe hid its secrets beneath the earth, just as we hide ours beneath conscience. And understand these corridors is, in a way, understanding why human beings have always needed to descend before ascending. Darkness in this sense is not punishment. It's preparation. It's the belly symbolic where old parts of us still breathe. Psychologists would call this shadow diving, the process in which we confront everything that we avoid seeing, but that silently determines our choices. And it's not. Is this exactly what happens when we enter an old tunnel? First comes the resistance, then the adjustment of the senses, and finally, a strange familiarity that it seems to whisper, "You've been here before." Maybe because symbolically we really were. Throughout life, we all walk through narrow internal passages, trying to find an exit, an expansion, a new light. The European underground then becomes a mirror, psychological, a mineral reflection of the human journey towards one's own depth. The contrast arises when we realize that the further we descend, the quieter everything becomes, returns, and this silence is not empty. It is revelation. It dissolves distraction, erases noise, returns to the spirit the ability to hear what was lost. In the internal tunnels and external factors, we are forced to slow down, breathing more carefully, trusting the step, not in the landscape. And this reveals a spiritual secret that many mystics knew. There is knowledge that can only be received in the absence of light, because the light reveals what exists, but darkness reveals what we are. Emotional synthesis appears as an inner flash. Perhaps what we are looking for in these tunnels are not history but memories, remembering that life is made of layers, remembering that there are parts of us that only flourish in silence, remembering that, before from being surface beings, we were deep beings, connected to the earth, to the mystery, to the invisible. And that's why the underground attracts us, because it speaks a language ancient, a language that we recognize even without knowing how to pronounce it. In the end, understanding these corridors is understanding that every human journey is, at the same time, geographic and interior. We walk on the earth, but also within it. We walk through the world, but also inside our soul. And recognizing this duo passage, we realize that nothing is really separate. History, psychology, spirituality, everything converges in the same fertile darkness that shapes us. But before we end this descent, there is still one last door to go through, that which does not open with maps, but with silence. Want to go down with me to the ultimate corridor? There is a moment at the end of every descent when we realize that we are no longer exploring tunnels, we are exploring ourselves. The stone walls become mirrors, silence becomes language, and what seemed like just archaeology reveals its true face, an ancient calling, a memory that spans the ages for us asking who we really are when no one is looking. In the underground of Europe, we discovered that history was never just a record, but a pulse. It was never just facts, but mineral memory carefully guarded by the earth that sustains us. And then, as we reach the last hallway, something changes. We didn't find an answer definitive, but a deeper question. Because maybe the underground doesn't exist for reveal secrets, but to return us to the state of humility, in which mystery returns be sacred. There, in the encounter between shadow and silence, we understand that light is not the opposite of darkness. It is its natural unfolding, that we only fully see when we accept walking through places where our vision cannot accompany us, that some truths only reveal themselves when the spirit, unarmed, agrees to listen. And so, after crossing civilizations, chambers, Memories and Reflections, the synthesis reveals. Europe's underground corridors don't just hold history. They guard humanity. They keep what we were, what we forgot, and what we can become. Upon emerging from them, we carry a new perception, that no path is totally dark when we walk it with awakened awareness. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be remembering the path. What if what we call depth is just the beginning of a light that has not yet do we learn to name?